day 5. So we've gone through a lot of information right now since last Tuesday, so a little over a week. Yesterday I went over roadway templates, which kind of introduces into the corridor modeling. So without hesitation, we'll go into day 5 with corridor modeling. So what we'll go through is we're going to go through the setup and creation of corridor. I'm going to talk a little bit about best practices, and then Jeff's going to jump in, kind of finish that out, and then jump into template intervals under corridor objects. So again, corridor objects, that's that little bucket. We'll go through that too as we get there, but all of your modeling options, corridor options, or a lot of them are in the bucket as we refer to it. So we'll go over that pretty in depth. Modeling pavement areas, best practices on those things, which we kind of touched on a little bit with templates yesterday with the end conditions and some of those different elements. And then quarter to quarter modeling, so utilizing corridor edges and how those mix with each other. Assigning super elevations, target aliasing. So we'll go over gore areas a little bit and target aliasing, plus kind of using some of the point controls for that. And then the end conditions of the target aliasing that we touched on in the templates yesterday, targeting pavement areas and having end conditions so that your base. And then linear templates, we'll go over the pros and cons, uses of those. Surface templates, just some items that you can use surface templates for. Corridor clipping and referencing on the best practices for that, and when and why we would use it, and when and we wouldn't use it, and why not. Corridor updates and the reattach, so synchronizing, connecting to geometry, different things like that, of if things get disconnected and broken and how we fix that. So those will be some of the things that we touch on. And so as far as the best practices go, one of the big things just to kind of keep in mind as you start that, again, going back to day 1, only referencing what you need. So really what you need in that file is going to be your existing surface, of course, because you got to connect to it, and then your geometry. So those 2 things are the things that are needed, that need to stay in there, that need to remain. Then you'd have your working container file that we talked about, like if you have right-of-way lines that you need to have in there to reference to, your existing planimetrics, if you need to pull those in to see some of the areas you need to tie into with your corridors. So some of that stuff where we talked about the non-attributed elements in those files themselves, that it being in your working container. Making sure that you have your current ITL, your project ITL. We talked a little bit about that yesterday. Each project needs to have an ITL, a template library. So make sure that that's in there as well. One of the biggest things too, know your project. Jeff will get into it a little bit more as far as corridor lengths and things like that. But know your project, know how you want to design it and model it to your project. So really have that background and that knowledge of what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Utilize multiple windows while doing this. So don't get used to just running a corridor without being, looking at some of your sections, looking at verticals, looking at how things operate and how they work. The other thing is then we'll also get into, when we look at the corridors and the corridor design, I do have examples. We've talked about 2D, 3D, what we use for production, but it's also talking about our corridors and how we use those for not only plan production, but also for design review through iModels and those different elements. So I think with that said, Jeff, did you want to kind of finish up touching on best practices, and then we'll pause after that before we jump into corridor objects?
Yeah. I guess to continue on with best practices, a big thing is corridor length, and that obviously will affect the processing time of the corridor. And so you generally want to break up if you have long sections or even shorter complex sections, you want to break those up into multiple corridors. So like for, I don't know, a relatively simple rule job with no retaining walls and, simple cut fill slopes, you could probably get away with 2 miles as your like max. But again, that's project specific. You may want to lay it out, test it, and if it's already a little slow, cut that back a good bit. But in an urban environment, if you have intersections every so often, it's probably best to break up your corridors based on intersections, things like that. Things get a little more complex in those areas. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's any. Do you want me to just get into creating the corridor right now, or do you want that to be a new video?
Yeah, I think we'll pause, but yeah, like I'll just add on to what Jeff said, like with the intersections, but also like if you're on one of the major highways, like let's say 25 I-70, one of the bigger ones where if you do start having interchanges, a mile apart, half mile apart, really just kind of trying in breaking those things up, keep your interchanges separate from your main lines, and even breaking up your interchanges with your ramps and that type of thing. So again, going back to federating files and making it easier to connect the pieces. Big thing, right, is those of you that have worked in SS2, and where the data resided outside of the file, it was much different than where you could almost kind of have everything in one, all of your graphics, just simply because it was graphics. The data was outside. Now that the data is attached to the file, that's why we have to be a little bit more cognizant of how we split things up. I would say with that, Sahar, let's go ahead and stop recording.